Start with caffeine, because it's the one hiding in plain sight. The compound was first isolated in 1819 by a German chemist named Friedlieb Ferdinand Runge, working at the request of the poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who'd handed Runge a batch of coffee beans and simply asked him to figure out what was in them. What Runge found was a molecule shaped almost exactly like adenosine, the chemical your brain steadily accumulates over the course of a day to signal accumulating fatigue. Caffeine doesn't give you energy. It blocks the adenosine receptor, so your brain can't read the tiredness signal that's already there. Here's the thing nobody tells you. The crash you feel when caffeine wears off isn't a side effect. It's the backlog of adenosine finally getting through the door all at once. Nicotine works on an entirely different lock. It mimics acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter your body uses for everything from muscle movement to memory formation. And it does this specifically at a receptor subtype that, when repeatedly activated, triggers dopamine release in the brain's reward center. Tobacco use in the Americas dates back at least 3,000 years, with residue found in pipes at archaeological sites in Alabama. But the chemistry behind why it's so relentlessly habit-forming wasn't mapped until the 20th century. Here's where it gets interesting. Nicotine reaches the brain from an inhaled cigarette in about 7 seconds, faster than a drug injected directly into a vein reaches the brain from the arm. That speed of onset is the whole story of why it grabs hold so fast. Alcohol is older than agriculture itself. Pottery residue from the Jiahu site in China's Henan province, dated to roughly 7,000 BCE, shows a fermented rice and honey beverage that predates written language by 4,000 years. Mechanically, alcohol enhances GABA, your brain's primary braking neurotransmitter, which is why it slows reaction time and loosens inhibition, while simultaneously suppressing glutamate, the brain's main accelerator. You're pressing the brake and cutting the gas at the same time. Sound familiar? That's the exact opposite mechanism from nicotine and caffeine, and it's why you can't just average alcohol's effects against a stimulant and expect to land somewhere in the middle. The two systems don't cancel out, they collide. Cannabis takes a different route entirely. The plant contains THC, a compound that binds to cannabinoid receptors your brain already had waiting for it, because your body naturally produces its own cannabinoid-like molecules, called endocannabinoids, involved in appetite, mood, and memory regulation. Raphael Mechoulam, an Israeli chemist working in Rehovot, first isolated and identified THC's structure in 1964, essentially founding the entire scientific field of cannabinoid research from a single lab bench. Archaeological evidence from a 2,500-year-old burial site in the Pamir Mountains shows charred cannabis residue with unusually high THC content, suggesting selective cultivation for psychoactive strength was happening in Central Asia well before the Common Era. Cocaine, in its concentrated modern form, is a 19th century invention layered on top of a 3,000-year-old practice. Andean communities chewed coca leaf slowly, absorbing well under 1% alkaloid content through the cheek over hours. In 1859, a German chemist named Albert Niemann isolated pure cocaine from the leaf as part of his doctoral dissertation and died of an infection contracted during his lab work just 2 years later, never living to see what his isolated compound would become. Pure cocaine floods the brain's reward pathway by blocking the reuptake of dopamine, meaning dopamine that would normally get reabsorbed and recycled just piles up in the synapse instead. Here's the cross-comparison that matters. It's a similar reward pathway mechanism to nicotine, just far more direct and far more concentrated, which is exactly why the two substances differ so dramatically in intensity, despite hitting a related target. MDMA was first synthesized in 1912 by chemists at the German pharmaceutical company Merck, filed as a patent for an intermediate compound, and then essentially forgotten for over 60 years. It resurfaced in the 1970s through the work of Alexander Shulgin, a chemist who'd left a position at Dow Chemical to study psychoactive compounds independently out of his own home lab in Lafayette, California. Mechanically, MDMA forces a massive, simultaneous release of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which is why its emotional effects feel qualitatively different from a typical stimulant. It's not just alertness, it's an overwhelming surge of social warmth, because serotonin release at that scale directly affects emotional bonding circuitry. LSD is where the story shifts from substances humans found to substances humans built from scratch. Albert Hofmann synthesized it at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel in 1938 while researching ergot fungus compounds, shelved it, then revisited it in April 1943, and accidentally absorbed a trace dose through his skin, triggering the first recorded acid trip in history on a bicycle ride home, now known as Bicycle Day. LSD binds to the serotonin 2A receptor with extraordinary strength, active at doses measured in millionths of a gram, making it among the most potent psychoactive compounds ever discovered by weight. Psilocybin mushrooms follow a similar receptor pathway to LSD, but arrived in Western science through a completely different door. The Mazatec people of Oaxaca, Mexico, used them ceremonially for at least 2,000 years, and in 1955, an American banker named R. Gordon Wasson became one of the first outsiders permitted to witness a ceremony led by a curandera named Maria Sabina. Psilocybin converts to psilocin in the body and activates the same serotonin 2A receptor LSD does, just with a shorter 4 to 6 hour duration compared to LSD's 8 to 12. Ketamine started its life as a battlefield tool, not a party drug. It was synthesized in 1962 by a chemist named Calvin Stevens and approved for medical use in 1970. Deployed extensively as a field anesthetic during the Vietnam War, specifically because, unlike most anesthetics, it doesn't suppress breathing or blood pressure. Mechanically, it blocks NMDA receptors, which are central to how neurons communicate about pain and sensory input, producing a dissociative effect, where the brain essentially stops integrating signals from the body in the normal way. Here's the thing that separates it from every substance we've covered so far. It's not primarily working through dopamine or serotonin at all, which is exactly why its effects feel so categorically different from stimulants or classic psychedelics. Opioids give us the oldest written drug record on Earth. Sumerian tablets from roughly 3400 BCE, found in the region of modern-day Iraq, refer to the poppy plant as Hull Gil, the joy plant. Morphine, the plant's primary active compound, is shaped almost identically to endorphins, the pain-killing molecules your own body already produces after injury or intense exercise. Morphine simply occupies the same mu-opioid receptor and floods it far harder and longer than the body's own supply ever would. Methamphetamine closes the loop on the stimulant side of this story. First synthesized from amphetamine in Japan in 1919 by chemist Akira Ogata, it was mass-distributed to Japanese factory workers and Axis soldiers during the Second World War to fight fatigue on production lines and battlefields alike. Mechanically, it doesn't just block dopamine reuptake the way cocaine does. It forces neurons to actively reverse their transport mechanism and dump stored dopamine directly into the synapse, which is why its stimulant effect tends to run longer and harder than cocaine's. Benzodiazepines bring us back to that same GABA system alcohol uses, but through a cleaner, more targeted delivery. The first one, chlordiazepoxide, was discovered almost by accident in 1955 by a chemist named Leo Sternbach at Hoffmann-La Roche, who'd shelved a batch of compounds he assumed were failures, only to have a lab assistant test one 2 years later during a routine cleanup and find it had powerful calming effects. Benzodiazepines enhance GABA's braking effect on the nervous system with far more precision than alcohol's blunt, whole-brain approach, which is exactly why they became the preferred medical tool for anxiety and seizures, once doctors needed that same braking effect without alcohol's broader collateral damage.